with a knife video for you. And today I've got a couple of knives that I want to share that are both really interesting to me. Both of these are new knives from their respective companies, the 8010 from Cold Steel and the Native Chief from Spyderco. Both of these have a lot of similarities, similar materials, similar size, similar locking mechanism, even a similar price point. But at the same time, these could not be more different. And so I thought these knives offered a really interesting opportunity to have a discussion about what we look for in knives, about striking balance in terms of utility and toughness and slicing power and all kinds of things that we sort of weigh in the balances of knife design and knife preferences, and how all of those things interact with one another. Now, there are a couple of knives that I've got sort of set off to the side that I think represent an interesting middle ground between these two, and we'll bring that up as well. And then I'll also talk about knives that perhaps go too far in one direction or the other, because in fact both of these are reasonably well balanced knives themselves, and they don't represent a huge sacrifice where they've just completely thrown one characteristic out the window. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But the first point that I want to bring up as it relates to these two knives, and I really want to have your guys' feedback down in the comment section. So I'd love to see how you guys kind of think through this for your own collection, for your own buying preferences. But these two knives bring up a question that is, I think, really relevant to all of us as knife users, and perhaps if you're the person who's watching this thinking, I just want to buy one knife. All right, if you're like me, you buy both, okay? And I know many of you watching would buy both. But that said, I know there are many people out there who, are looking for a particular thing from their knife. And so what is it that you primarily want out of your EDC knife, okay? Is it, a defensive weapon? Is it a tool? Is it, utility cutting tasks that you want it for? Maybe you work in construction, or maybe you're outdoors a lot. Is it food prep? Is it cutting cardboard or opening packages? You work in a warehouse where there's a lot of zip ties and a lot of, sur- wrapping to cut off of things, plastic wrap and stuff like that. Maybe you do deliveries or something. Do you look for it as a safety tool? Maybe you're thinking of, cutting clothes off a patient, or it's a survival tool. You work in a job where there's a high likelihood that you'll be like lost in the bush on a regular basis. As I said, I mentioned before, is it a defensive weapon or an offensive weapon? Maybe you're a soldier, or you're a Navy SEAL who gets dropped into, I don't know, behind enemy lines and has to kill your enemies stealthily or something like that. Or at least you have visions of yourself doing that kind of thing. Okay, so what is it that a knife is primarily doing for you? Why do you carry a knife? What characteristics do you most want it to achieve? If you bring an apple to work every day and your primary job for your knife is to cut the apple up into slices, then there's a certain type of preference that you're going to have, right? You're going to be looking for essentially a folding paring knife. If you're outdoors processing wood all the time, or if you're on a construction site opening bags of concrete, all of those uses may require a different emphasis in your knife, okay? And these two knives, I think, represent different users, different people who are looking for something from their knife that's maybe quite different. So let's get into some of the characteristics between these two, or some of the similarities and differences between these two. Okay, we have two G10 lockback knives. Here, of course, we have a knife that is definitely on the hard use end of the spectrum. This is a knife that's meant to really, really take a beating and to not have any issues with that. Whether you talk about the strength of the lock, or the thickness of the blade, or the hollow grind with a lot of material carried out here to the tip, right? This is a knife that's designed to really be used pretty heavily, okay, and to stand up to some pretty hard use or even abuse. If you take a look at this knife, it's a little thinner, okay? It's still quite large, but the blade stock is rather thin. It's extremely thin out here at the tip. All right, so this is a knife that, and it's nice and thin behind the edge as well. So this is a knife that's really about cutting performance. This is almost a folding kitchen knife. Okay, so super thin, super slim, and that means that you're probably not going to want to use this for some of the tasks that you'd be comfortable using this one for, okay? Now, I will say this. One of the things I like about the 8010 is that it still cuts really, really well because of that hollow grind. And I'm going to go on record now as saying I'm really disappointed that they've dropped the hollow grind. I did contact Cold Steel, and they told me that Andrew Demko made the decision that this would be a knife that would benefit from a flat grind, making it a little tougher and a little more durable. So they've actually taken the emphasis that this knife already has and cranked it up a couple of notches. And that's where I want to go next, okay? There are certain characteristics of a knife that are going to limit other characteristics. All right, so if you want a knife to be as light as humanly possible and as easy to carry around as you can possibly get it to be, okay, that's going to limit a few things. So maybe you're going to make that knife a little bit smaller. Maybe you're going to make the knife a little bit thinner. And certainly this is a knife that carries really, really well in pocket. And so it's fairly lightweight, it's fairly slim. All right, now because of that, you sacrifice a little bit in terms of ergonomics. All right, this is not a knife that is quite as comfortable as the 8010 is going to be. All right. You may sacrifice a little bit in terms of blade stock. So we thin this out to make it as thin as possible because we're saving weight. In addition to making the knife perform better in slicing tasks, we're also making the overall knife lighter. All right. Now both of these are fairly large knives, and so certainly they're designed for someone who needs something with a little more blade length. So maybe you want this as, I don't know, maybe you cut up a lot of apples and oranges and grapefruits and stuff like that, and so you need that reach to get across the whole, whatever it is that you happen to be cutting. Both of these will do that pretty well. All right, but the idea is that, okay, depending on where I'm going with this, if I want a super, super lightweight knife, then I'm going to have to do some things that are going to affect toughness. Okay, so a knife like this, right, you're not trying to save weight, at least not very much. If you were trying to save weight, you'd thin this G10 way out. You'd probably abandon the aluminum altogether. You'd go with a thinner blade stock. You just try to reduce the overall amount of material here in any way that you possibly could. And if that was your main goal, to make a knife as light as possible, you wouldn't end up with something like this. You'd end up with something a little more like this. Now, if what you are going for is a defensive weapon. Okay, there's of course a school of thought that is all about, let's make a knife the best fighting implement that I possibly can, so that if I have to defend my life or if I have to engage in some kind of martial combat situation, I want a knife that is most suited for that. And in that regard, maybe you would end up with something a little more like this. And certainly Cold Steel does not shy away from that aspect of this sort of knife purpose continuum. So you'd want a knife with a big deep choil like this that's really, really positively gripped in hand. You'd want a knife with a thin cutting edge so that you can slice, but you want a knife that's pretty strong so that if you are trying to penetrate something, you don't wind up breaking the knife off, if you, I don't know, hit body armor or hit a button or something like that. Okay, and so perhaps, and actually a top swedge like this is something you often find on a fighting style knife because you want to have that penetrating ability. One of the main things you're going to do with a fighting knife is stab stuff, and so you want that ability to stab. All right, maybe you're just going to emphasize toughness and you want a knife that's going to be an absolute tank. And if you kind of think this through, perhaps a good example is like an axe or a splitting maul, right? That's all about toughness, right? This is just a massive hunk of steel that's all about being bashed into something, okay? Now, if you're out in the forest and all you have is an axe, you're going to have some limitations, right? You certainly aren't going to be able to use it for skinning an animal very well. You're not going to use it for even a lot of fine wood processing tasks. You can make kindling by just continuing to split whatever it is you're splitting, but something like a feather stick is almost completely out of the question with most axes, especially the way we use them, or at least the way I use my axes. They tend to get pretty dull pretty badly because I'm pounding on all kinds of stuff. All right. Now, having said that, you're going to pound with that axe and it's not going to break, it's not going to roll an edge. Yes, that edge is going to dull, but it probably wasn't that sharp to begin with. Now, if you tried to use a steel, even a knife like this, which is, pretty hard use, if you took this blade and just kind of attached it to a handle and started chopping with it, you would find out that this edge would not last very long because this steel is going to have properties that don't lend itself very well to that kind of pounding abuse. All right. On the other hand, a chef's knife, right, is not meant to be pounded on like that. I mean, maybe a cleaver, but generally you want something thin and slicey, something that moves through material with as little friction as possible, something that's very thin behind the edge. And so that's why I mentioned a minute ago that this is almost a folding chef's knife. It really is, pushing that side of the envelope. Now there are a couple design choices that to me don't make sense if that's your main goal. All right, and perhaps if we go even one step further to a paring knife, which is often just one super thin piece of steel with an edge on it, and all you're trying to do with that is create a knife that can, slice, that can move through material as easily as possible. All right. Now there are other considerations here. Okay, maybe your main priority is being fancy and high end, and so you include materials that titanium and mokotai and Damascus and zirconium and all kinds of stuff like that. Maybe it's inlaid with mother of pearl. Well, that kind of developing that kind of exclusivity and fanciness moves it out of a number of categories. Now it's not a useful knife in a number of ways because you want to be more careful with it. All right. And so we have all of these what would you say, goals that we might be shooting for in our knife design. And depending on what that goal is, we're going to make changes to how we've designed a knife and especially how we grind a blade and what handle materials we choose and how thin or how thick that handle is going to be, what locking mechanism we go with. All right, all of those things are going to be decided by what our end goal is trying to be. All right. And I say trying because sometimes I think a designer has a goal in mind and they get confused along the way and end up not achieving what they're trying to do. All right, so let's think for a few minutes about what these two knives do really, really well with some of that balance discussion in the back of our minds. So let's start off with the Spyderco Native Chief for a moment. Okay, so this is a knife, and perhaps we could have this discussion in a comparison between this and say the Spyderco Shaman as well. But this is a knife that does some things really, really well. Okay, so it's very, very carryable. It's a large knife. Okay. But when you drop this in your pocket, you hardly even know that you have it with you. It's very slim, it's very lightweight. And so certainly that seems to be one of the things that they were trying to achieve when they designed this knife. The other thing that this knife does really, really well is cuts. And I mean, super, super thin slicey blade. If you're slicing up apples or carrots or something like that, this is going to be a great cutting tool for that kind of work. It's really going to do that. The other thing this knife does well is it's comfortable. It provides lots of grip area, lots of traction, and so if you are doing a cutting task where it's quite extensive, you've got a lot of cutting to do, I think that's going to work really, really well. The only sort of sacrifice this makes along those lines is if you're cutting down onto a cutting board, the blade to handle relationship could be a little bit different. Okay, so if this is the surface I'm cutting on in order to show you guys on camera, if this is a cutting board, right, there's where my fingers hit and the blade still isn't touching yet. I've got to move things forward and I'm going to end up cutting with this portion of the blade mostly. All right. Now, obviously, in other uses, maybe I'm carving something or I'm holding whatever I'm cutting in my hand. That's different. The rest of the blade definitely comes into play more in that regard. If I'm cutting a big apple, let's say my hand is an apple, you can see I can reach all the way across. And as I push my way through, I'm probably going to do this kind of thing anyway. If you've noticed how you cut things, you probably do this kind of stuff with an apple or an onion or a grapefruit or whatever you happen to be cutting up. in that kind of roll. If it's cardboard, then it really doesn't matter. This will cut cardboard very well. You just don't need the same kind of reach. Now, the only, so that's, what does this knife do well? It cuts really, really well certainly in lighter use applications, and it carries really well. It's very lightweight, and so you get a lot of cutting power, a lot of blade length in a fairly small, lightweight package. It also feels great in hand. It's a very ergonomic knife. Now, moving over to the 8010, what does it do really well? Okay, well, it does a few things very, very well. One, it can take a beating, right? The lock strength is ridiculously high on the Triad lock. That's one of the things that makes it so great. I'm not suggesting that the lock strength isn't good on the Native Chief at all. It's still good, but it's not going to be as strong. The other thing this knife does really well is feels fantastic in hand. So if I've got a cutting task that's, just going to be really, really long, really, really onerous, I don't know, I've got 55 miles of cardboard to cut up. If I'm Pete over at Cedric Native Gear and Outdoors and I've got to cut 15 miles of rope, yeah, a handle like this is going to be fantastic. If I'm doing outdoor type of stuff where I really am going to have to push and put a lot of pressure behind my cut, a handle like this is fantastic, okay, because it really, really works well in that situation. If I'm going to, now I will say this knife does cut well also. It's going to split certain things. I would suspect, say, a carrot or a beet, all right, something really, really hard, this is probably not your best option. But if you're cutting apples, tomatoes, things like that, I guess a really, really crunchy apple, maybe not, because when you work up to the top part of this curve in the blade, you're going to get some wedge effect. That is, the knife is going to start pushing these two sides apart instead of slicing them apart at some point. Now, again, this depends on what you use your knife for and what you're looking for when you go out to buy a new knife. Are you looking for a knife that's going to cut carrots really well? Or maybe you never cut carrots, and so that's not a major consideration. All right, but the things that this is going to do well, yeah, it's super comfortable in hand. It's very tough, right? This lock is not likely to fail on you. This blade is not likely to break on you. Everything about this, or very much about this, is designed to be heavy duty and durable. Now, going from the hollow grind to the flat grind, here's my contention on that. And Andrew Demko, if you're watching, I'm not even trying to suggest that I know anywhere near as much about knives as you do, but I feel like the gain in toughness that you make, all right, and yes, there is a gain in toughness and durability that you make by going to a flat grind here. It's not enough, right? This is going to slice so much better than the flat grind that the extra toughness, extra durability, to me, is not worth it. Now, obviously, there are going to be some people, and again, I don't know, guys, how many of you are, right, this is going to be the weakest portion of the blade right here because it's very, very thin and it's going to slice really well. But to me, I never have a situation where I'm going to use my fingers here. I keep doing this in this video. Let's say I cut into something like this and now I'm going to start prying and putting torsional strength. I just don't do that. I can't even imagine a reason why you would do that. And so to me, the hollow grind makes way more sense because it allows you to get great cutting performance, all right, well, not sacrificing very much in terms of toughness or durability, but sacrificing just a little bit. But to me, it's in an area that you don't need any toughness or durability because who's doing that with their knife? Okay, so coming back to my comparison here, this knife, on the other hand, man, the weak point to me is the fragility of it. This blade is so slim and so long and just gets narrower and narrower and narrower here that by the time you get out to this tip, I mean, do not drop this knife, right? I know you keep it closed lots of times and the retention is very good. So if you drop it this way, yeah, no big deal. But boy, you are going to have to be so careful with that tip. The slightest bit of pressure and you could break it because look at how needle thin, come on, focus you. Look at how needle thin that blade is. And let me put the two of them side by side so you can really see the kind of difference that exists here. All right, so you have very, very little material here behind the edge. So this is a knife that you're going to have to exercise some care with when you're using it. I still like it an awful lot, and I regularly exercise that kind of care. I just don't pry with my knives at all, right? Ever. So to me, it's not a huge thing. I will say from time to time, a situation may arise where I need to do that kind of thing. Okay, so as I say, both of these have strengths and weaknesses, and you've got to figure out for yourself, and I do for myself, which of those you're going to emphasize and which of them you're going to be like, yeah, I don't really care about that. And so if you're a person that really, really cares about blade strength, this is probably a knife to avoid. If you're a person that doesn't care that much, then you would probably go, hey, I'd take this over this any day of the week. All right, for me, I don't really know. I carry and use both of them. I don't really, I guess if I was going outdoors, if I was hiking or something, I would take this knife over this one. But outside of that, for my daily carry and daily tasks, I wouldn't really have a huge preference between them. Now, I'm really curious to know what you guys suggested at the beginning of the video in terms of a knife that kind of lands in between these two. There are some knives that I think will kind of fit in between these two and perhaps offer the best of both worlds and maybe be a little more balanced. Although, again, I will say, I think both of these are pretty well balanced. Is this lock as strong as this lock? No, but is it strong enough? Absolutely. Are you likely to break this every single day, and as soon as you get it out, the blade's just gonna snap in half? No. All right, so I'm not saying that these knives are completely useless or that they're going way too far in one direction or the other. In fact, I find both of these knives pretty well balanced, but there are some that maybe walk that line a little closer to the middle. And one of the knives I want to share with you is the American Lawman. The American Lawman is very slim, very lightweight, so it definitely moves toward this point. It's also very tough and very durable, so it also captures a lot of good stuff from here. Now it's going to be a little more like this one in the hand. It's quite slim, and so may introduce some issues in terms of comfort. This is also a hollow ground blade, and I want to say they may have gone to a flat grind on this one as well. And again, that's a little disappointing to me. I definitely prefer a hollow grind. Thinking about the flat grind and hollow grind and all that stuff, I want to bring in another knife. I'm going to run out of room, so let's turn these on their side a little bit. And again, I may do a full comparison even between these two because I think that would be an interesting video to kind of work through. But here's another knife that I think strikes this balance maybe a little better than either one of these. Now, I will say this. The one weakness that this has when it comes to comparing it to some of the other knives that we've got out on the table here is the bearing pivot. And so the bearing pivot is going to introduce a certain amount of, a bit of a weak point because of the potential for junk and grime and crap to get in there. The other thing is all of these being backlocks, the compression lock is not going to be as strong. Now it's going to be adequately strong, okay? No question about it. But let me show you the main thing that I wanted to show you in terms of construction here, and that is the blade thickness. Hold on, let me work on this. There we go. Okay, so now you can probably, there we go. Now you can hopefully see the amalgam is definitely designed to be a little heavier duty. You can see in this direction and in this direction, there's a lot more material out at the tip. So if you are one of those guys that worries a little bit about breaking the knife, this may be a great option for you. And let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a full comparison and a full sort of breakdown between these two knives. There's a lot of similarity and there's a lot of difference as well. So I think this might be a worthwhile video to do. But I'll take your advice in, I'll take it under advisement what you guys think I should do in terms of a full video on these or just kind of maybe let this conversation be enough. All right, so there you go, guys. Now I'd love to, so these are the knives that I think kind of land in between these two. I absolutely love all of these knives, and I would recommend any one of them. If there's one out of these four that appeals to you the most, hey, go ahead and buy that one. I'm not suggesting for a second that, somehow one of these is so much better than the rest that all the others should be ignored. Certainly, the American Lawman probably strikes a balance that is going to appeal to the broadest audience out of all of these. Other than that, though, I really like them all, and I get a lot of joy out of owning them all. Okay, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this, on any of the points that we've made, and on how it plays out in your collection. What characteristics do you emphasize over others? Perhaps there's some of these knives that you would just avoid altogether, and some of them you just think are the greatest thing ever. I'd love to hear that as well. Thanks for watching. Look at go and I got a couple of these knives for sure. These two from White Mountain Knives. This one came from DLT Trading. DLT Trading does not like me to promote. Them alongside with somebody else, so just ignore that portion of the video, and I'm only going to put links to White Mountain Knives in here. But go over to my 8010 video, check that out, and there is a link to DLT, which does help the channel as well. In fact, probably to a greater degree even than the White Mountain Knives does. All right, thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as I say, I'd love to have some conversation with you guys in the comments about how this all plays out in real life and in your preferences when it comes to buying a knife. We will talk to you soon.